Functional symptoms, such as clicking and locking, are some of the most frequent findings in patients with temporomandibular joint disorders. Both the normal and pathological anatomy and function of this joint has caused a lot of speculations. Can you, Dr. Eriksson, review the anatomy of a temporomandibular joint?
This is a sagittal section of a right temporomandibular joint. Here you can see the condyle, the fossa and the tubercle. This is a disc. And here you have the upper joint compartment and the lower joint compartment, filled with blow water in order to stabilize the disc during sectioning. The soft tissue cover on the condyle is thin. This is probably an artifact. And it's also thin in the fossa and somewhat thicker on the tubercle. The posterior band of the disc is situated superior to the condyle. The posterior attachment is a little bit thinner and longer than seen in an absolutely normal joint. The lower head of the lateral pterygoid muscle is seen here, and this is the superior head. The knowledge of anatomy is essential for understanding of joint pathology. During orthography, we have learned that the function of the joint is also very essential. Which are the possibilities to study joint function?
Arthrography, surgery, and arthroscopy can give an impression of the function of a joint, but it is far from easy to understand the complex function of this joint by observing it through a surgical opening or through a thin arthroscope. Videotape recording of arthrography is probably the most effective way of studying joint function today. This technique is, however, not optimal for educational purposes, since the interpretation of the arthrograms requires some training. Dr. Isberg and myself studied the course of clicking temporomandibular joints in autopsy specimens by the aid of high-speed cinematography. This gave Dr. Eriksson and myself the idea of making a videotape of functional alterations of a temporomandibular joint. This is a normal temporomandibular joint. The disc is biconcave and it's located in a superior position. The central thin part of the disc is consistently lying in between the condyle and tubercle. During opening, there is rotation in the lower compartment and more of translation in the upper compartment. In this joint, the disc is also located in a superior position. The disc is biconcave, with its posterior thick part located on top of the condyle in the closed mouth position, and posterior to the condyle at maximal opening. There is, however, a small perforation in the central part of the disc. During opening movement, there is rotation in the lower compartment and more of translation in the upper compartment. There were no crepitation or clicking from this joint during movement. The location of a perforation to the central thin part of the disc is relatively unusual. In joints with disc displacement, it is our experience that perforations usually are located in the posterior attachment and not in the disc proper. When the condyle is distracted downwards from the temporal component, the perforation can be clearly seen. In this joint, the disc is anteriorly displaced, and it's reduced on opening with a click. These joints demonstrate reciprocal clicking, which implies clicking during opening followed by clicking during closing. The disc is here again anteriorly displaced. The configuration of the joint compartments corresponds very well to what has been seen on arthrograms and to observations during surgery. Reciprocal clicking is a clinical sign of anterior disc displacement with reduction. In this joint, the disc is biplanar. It's located on top of a condyle, but during opening it's slightly displaced medially, and in association with this displacement, clicking was registered. The posterior attachment between the disc and capsule is considerably thinner than in a normal case. During closing, the disc is again replaced to a more correct position between the condyle and temporal component. The disc is lying in between the condyle and temporal component, but there is a type of reciprocal clicking caused by a mediolateral movement of a disc. The next joint has a medial displacement of a disc. During opening, the disc is moving in lateral direction, and here the disc can be seen. Now it's displaced medially anteriorly again. And here it's replaced to a more normal position and displaced again. Clinically, it can be difficult to differentiate the pure anterior displacement from an anterior or anterior medial displacement. The next joint demonstrates anterior disc displacement without reduction, which implies that the disc is consistently lying anterior to the condyle. During all mandibular movements, the disc is lying anterior to the condyle, and at maximum opening, the disc is folding downwards as seen here. There is a considerable stretching in the posterior disc attachment at maximum opening, and even if the disc is displaced, there can be a good range of motion due to deformation of the disc and stretching of a posterior disc attachment. The next joint demonstrates a large perforation of the disc. There is only a small piece of the disc remaining anterior to the condyle. This joint demonstrated crepitation and irregular movement